Thank you for doing this.
It is my great pleasure, Larry.
Yeah.
And thank you for writing this fantastic book, which I was also lucky enough to review. So I've been very deep in the human scale.
Very gratified by that. Thank you.
No, it's a fantastic book, and I was hoping we could just start because I'm assuming some folks probably haven't read it yet. It just came out a week ago, but if you could maybe discuss a little bit about the book, the story behind it, and I was saying backstage maybe you could just read a short passage for us.
Sure. Well, this is a mystery. Mm-hmm. Actually, there are two mysteries in this book. One is the plot of the novel, which is set in Hebron, which is a very stressed environment with the settlers on one side and set in one of the largest cities in Palestine. And the Israeli chief of police is found without his head in a Muslim cemetery, and it falls on his deputy, Yossi Ben-Gal, to investigate the crime. And who did it and why? And that's the essential mystery. To be honest, Yossi, who is a tough guy, like a lot of the Israelis I knew, in Mossad and the IDF and so on, there's a certain type. And, he believes with all of his heart that Israel is the last safe refuge for the Jewish people, and he'll do anything to defend it. And when his chief is killed, he's looking for a suspect, and into town comes this Palestinian American named Anthony Malik, and falls under suspicion because he was supposed to meet the chief that morning. And it turns out he works in the FBI. So he has skills that Yossi doesn't have, but he's a total foreigner in the environment. So the two of them have to work together to solve the crime. And the question that the novel poses, can they? These are people that are very similar in some respect, but they're separated by the tides of history, of ethnicity, of religion, of culture. So that's the first mystery. The second mystery is, why is this conflict, why has it gone on for so long? I mean, I'm the same age as Israel. I'm not trying to brag or anything. But all of my life, this conflict has gone on. And really, in some respects, it's just been one long continual war, broken up into pieces of relative calm and absolute ferocity. And in my lifetime, people say that this is never going to be solved, but things like apartheid in South Africa ended, the Soviet Union dissolved, we elected a black man president. None of these things was expected to happen until they did. But this conflict keeps going on and on and on. So writing the book was an opportunity for me to bore into the society of Israel and West Bank and get behind the eyes of these characters and see the world from their perspective. And my goal is, no matter what you think about the conflict, you have to see it through the eyes of one of the characters who you don't agree with.
Would you read the passage we discussed? Because I feel like it kind of gets at that theme in a really nice way.
I should note that on top of being a detective story, it's also a romance. Yes. And so Yossi has a very attractive daughter, which comes to Tony Malik's attention. And she talks about how Hebron is the world capital of hatred. Everybody hates something, somebody. What do you hate, he asks. I hate the hatred. Honestly, I can't stand it. Every other emotion gets squeezed out. Do you know why? Because there's an even bigger emotion inside all of us, on both sides, Jews and Arabs. An emotion we're afraid to express. She was quiet, as if the answer was charged with some kind of power she was reluctant to release. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. Grief. Israel was created by a grieving people. If we had dealt with that, if we had accepted our suffering, we might have found happiness, if such a thing exists for a nation. But we let our grief define us. All this rage, this depression, shame, this insistence on revenge, they are all expressions of a grief that is too big for us, too big for any people. And then we made the Palestinians in our image a grieving and dispossessed people. She looked apologetically at Malik. I shouldn't speak for you. Is that how you feel as a Palestinian? Malik took another sip of wine. The conversation was taking him into deeper water than he had expected, and his head was already clouded by drink. The longer I'm in Palestine, the more American I feel. But something has changed. It's deep. I'm getting acquainted with where I came from, or at least part of me, the Palestinian have. I can see what I lost, the connection with my roots. But I haven't been able to... He hesitated, but he felt propelled to explain something he didn't fully understand. I spent months interviewing members of ISIS at an American base in Syria. My Arabic wasn't perfect, but there weren't that many of us in the Bureau who spoke it at all. Our assignment was to find out what made these guys become terrorists. A lot of them were well educated. They had a grudge against America, and I understood that. They all said Islam was under attack, even though they were the ones attacking Muslims. With Al-Qaeda, the big promise was that you'd be rewarded with virgins in paradise. But with ISIS, you didn't have to wait. Just sign up and they'll issue you a sex slave. This was a huge motivator for a lot of lonely young men. There was this Iraqi kid. We called him Howdy because he had big eyes and red cheeks, and he reminded some of the old guys of Howdy Doody, this television show they all watched when they were children. Howdy was 12 when I talked to him. Friendly, smart. His parents took him to Syria when he was 9 to liberate Muslims, they told him. He became part of their youth group, Cubs of the Caliphate. I saw a video of this same child assassinating ISIS captives. They were lined up on their knees, blindfolded, and he walked behind them with a handgun and shot them each in the head, 11 of them, one after another. He never hesitated, an absolute stone-cold killer. Howdy was fixed on the fact that I was Palestinian. He couldn't understand how I could also be American. He told me, "We're doing this for you." For Palestine, he meant. And for a while, that became what Palestine was for me. An excuse to turn children into barbarians. I'm still trying to figure all this out.
Thank you. Will you talk a little bit about Tony Malik and the actual, the opening of the book? Because the book doesn't open in Palestine or in Israel. Could you just preview us to that and talk? Because his character is fascinating too, because it's sort of, he's our window, at least I felt he was sort of our window into America.
Yeah, and it's helpful to have some naive person, go into an exotic situation where the reader might not know very much about it. Like a lot of my characters, he's based on a kind of collage of people that I've known, FBI agents and intelligence people who are in the Arab world. And he's a counter-terrorist. Basically what he does is follow the terrorist money and see where it comes from. So he's never been to Palestine. He's worked in the Arab world, as you see, he was in Syria. But when the novel opens, he's in Jordan, and there's an airplane that is wired with a bomb. They get the bomb off and take it to a facility outside of the capital and try to defuse it, and it blows up. And everybody's killed except for Malik, who is badly wounded and loses the sight of an eye. And he's in the hospital for some months getting repaired. Meantime, he had a romantic partner in New York that he wondered if she would accept him back. So he's crippled by this wounded by this bomb, and
sort of lovelorn too. I felt.
Yeah, he's lonely.
Yeah.
I mean, and his father, his parents were divorced. His mother lived in Little Rock, so he spent most of his time growing up in Little Rock as the only Arab kid. But being Tony Malik, he sounded Italian, and so he got away with it until 9/11. And it was a hard time for a lot of Muslims in America. So he was formed by that as well.
And then the opportunity presents itself for him to travel back to Palestine and visit his family.
He's desperate to get back in the Bureau, but he's not sure that they would accept him. And because he'd have to take the tests again. And they're really difficult tests. And he's still a little confused by the explosion, but he takes the opportunity to go see his cousin get married. And he sees her on Facebook. This is as close as he's ever been to anybody else in his family.
And you've spent, 40 plus years traveling in and out of that part of the world?
Yeah, my wife Roberta and I, we lived in Cairo and taught English to kids who were trying to get into the American University in Cairo.
This was in 1980, I think?
1969 to '71. Okay. I beg your pardon.
I'm sorry.
Much longer ago than I'd like to admit, but it was. We had a wonderful time, and honestly, I was a conscientious objector, and I had to do service that was at least 50 miles from home, paid very little, and was in the interest of the United States. So I came to New York, and I thought, I'll go to the UN, and they'll give me a job far, far away and pay me very little. And they said, no, we don't do that. But here's a list of American institutions abroad, and one of them, American University in Cairo, had an office across the street at 866 UN Plaza. So I walked across the street, and half an hour later they said, can you leave tonight? I said, it should have been a sign, right? And no, my girlfriend's back in Boston. I haven't told my parents what I'm doing. Can you leave tomorrow? Yeah, I can go tomorrow. So next day I flew in and landed in Cairo at midnight and taught my first class at 9 in the morning. So that was and I don't think I even knew what language they spoke.
Yeah.
I mean, I was totally naive. And yet over the course of those 2 years, it was a real, for a very parochial kid from Dallas, it was a real eye-opener. And I went back and forth to the region a number of times reporting, especially after 9/11, but before then as well. The first time I went to Hebron was 1997. And I went in because there was some activity that was, there were some Palestinian kids who were throwing rocks at soldiers. And at that point, that was worldwide news. And but there was a shopping street in Hebron called Al-Shahada Street. And you have to picture this. It's a little narrow medieval street, no wider than this stage. And there are little bazaar things set up, fruit dealers and everything. And a Jewish settlement just above this. And these Jewish kids throwing rocks down at these schoolgirls in their little school outfits. And one of them started throwing rocks at me. And that really pissed me off. And I just wanted to pick up that rock and throw it back. Yeah. But there was an Israeli soldier up there with his M4 protecting the kids, allowing them to do that. And then in 2023, in February, I went back to Hebron again, and I reflected on the fact that these were children, abusing each other back then. And weirdest thing happened. I had probably the only peace advocate in Hebron, Issa Amro, was taking me around the old city, which is a World Heritage Site. And this young Israeli, they're all young soldiers, they're like 18, 19, and they were policing. Without provocation, we had a conversation, and my first job was a race relations reporter covering the civil rights movement. So this reminded me a lot of the, Greensboro sit-ins, the bus riders, nonviolence. This was his tact. But the soldier had grabbed him by the neck. And Issa was saying, call your commander. We're not doing anything wrong here. And so he called his commander and said, I have a bunch of liberals here. I said, I'm from Texas. But anyway, without further provocation, he picked him up by the neck and hurled him down on the ground, Issa's head missing the curb by an inch. And then he kicked him so hard he nearly fell down. I'm convinced he would have killed him if we hadn't. But we're two Westerners, me and a Belgian photographer, watching this. The photographer filming it. None of that. He felt so empowered to do this that it didn't matter that it was being observed and that it would be posted. All those things must have been in his mind. And I reflected back to those children on the balcony throwing the stones down. And wonder how this continues to persevere. This sense of, I guess, the reason this book is called The Human Scale is there's this disproportionate sense of the value of human life. And when I was in Israel, and then I went into Gaza when Gilad Shalit, this young Israeli soldier, was captured by Hamas and held for 5 years. And the Israelis never found him. And finally they traded 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for this one Israeli. And it was such a striking thing to me that one life could equal 1,000 others that I began to wonder, what is the scale? And what are the values that we're measuring here? And I think at the root of how durable this conflict is the fact that some people are highly valued and some people are scarcely valued at all.
I have a confession to make, which is, often in my journalism, I will just sort of, have an opportunity to go somewhere, and I'll say I'm going to go there, and interesting things will happen, and I will write about them. Maybe you've been afflicted with the same type of impetuous behavior in your life.
You never know what you just go turn over stones.
And I had a chance to go to Hebron in probably 2014. I went with a friend of mine who's a photographer who'd been there for a long time. He said, "Why don't you come with me? And you'll write something about it." And I went, and I stayed for a while, not that long. And it's one of the few times I've gone and I've walked away and I said, I think I have nothing that I can say that adds to this, because I'm such a novice in this subject, and it's so knotted and layered. And my question to you is, you've been covering this and been in the region for years. When was the moment that you felt like you wanted to embark on telling the story? And then, you write fiction, you write journalism, and this is a very specific type of book. You could have written sort of a down-the-middle literary novel, but it's a detective story. I'd just love to know, kind of in your consciousness, how you sort of landed on this story for this subject in this format.
Well, I wrote a screenplay basically about this 20 years ago, and it didn't work, and Hollywood wasn't ready for a story like that. But the characters were always in my mind, and I think that when I went back to Hebron, that first time and had the kids throwing stones at me, that was another one of those things where I was puzzled. I was mad, but I was thinking, why are they doing this? And how is it that this sense of otherness, that another person is less than a full being to you? And I decided that hatred is actually a very appealing emotion, and you can unload everything on somebody else.
It's an easy emotion,
and you're forgiven everything that you do to that person because they're not a real person; they're the other. And this is true of both sides. the savagery that erupted on October 7th. You know, I'll tell you, this is another confession that's kind of weird. When I was in Hebron, when I was in Gaza, this was in 2009, after Operation Cast Lead, another one of those mowing the lawn experiences by the Israelis, which they were looking for Gilad Shalit. And you know, I thought that Gaza had been leveled, but it didn't look like what we see now. And I got an interview with this Hamas leader, and his name is Khalil Ahaya. And it was at a school, a little public school, and it was July, and it was hot as hell. And all these kids were in Hamas summer camp, and they were wearing green beanies and, you know, singing Hamasi songs, and all these Hamas leaders were in folding chairs outside. And then finally, we go inside for me to interview El-Haya. And the night before, I had in this little hotel, they had a cafe on the roof, and I was trying to decide what I was going to eat. I had seen the beach, which was green with sewage. I thought, I'm not going to eat fish. So I knew that they brought cattle through the tunnels. So I thought, I'll order a steak. And the waiter said, would you like that well done? Or very well done? Yeah. And I didn't take the hint. So that next morning, when I was waiting to talk to the Hamas leader, it occurred to me that I was not doing well. And so we were talking kind of like this, except that there was a semicircle of Hamas leaders with their big boots on and so on. And it was sort of an Oprah feeling. You know, I'm interviewing this guy. And suddenly I thought, I was looking up at this fan that was just going around, and I thought, I'm going to faint. And I said, don't faint. Don't faint in front of Hamas. You know, it was like the lowest moment of my life, and out I went. I just fell out of the chair. And out of nowhere, they'd bring in a mattress and cover it with prayer mats. And I lay down on it, and I continued to interview Khalil Ahaya, taking my notes like this, and surrounded by all these dusty boots. And you know, it was really humiliating, but they were very kind to me. These are the people that planned October 7th. And Khalil Ahaya is now the leader of Hamas. He's replaced Yahya Sinwar. So as a writer and a journalist and a fiction author, you have to see the dark and light shadows in the human personality. Khalil Ahaya was nice to me, and it was at a very humiliating moment in my life, and I'm grateful for that. But I have to account for the fact that he was also a barbarian. You know, he was preparing an attack that he imagined would change the calculus in the Middle East, and it did, but not as he might imagine. On the other hand, he's now the person that's negotiating peace. You know, it reminds me of this Egyptian comic I really loved. His name was Ali Salam, and he had this long, rubbery face. And he said, you know, the Middle East is now, the America is now a Middle Eastern country, and you're going to have to think very old thoughts.
That's a good point. To that point, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of your other work, Larry. You know, obviously there is, you know, people will, I think, see how in some ways, you know, the human scale could be adjacent to the looming tower. Yeah. I was thinking a lot about going clear in the prison of belief. Yeah. When I was reading this book as well. That's interesting. And I was just wondering if you see sort of any connections, because I mean, one of the things that is clear in this book is that people are trapped in ideologies that are not compromising of their humanity. I don't know. I'd just be interested if, do you draw on that?
A lot of it is powered by religion.
Right.
And religion has been a subject of fascination to me in my entire career. And my first book was about the Amish, and it went downhill after that. But I've observed that, people who have strong political views, that may not affect their behavior at all. Mm-hmm. But people with strong religious views, those views tend to govern their lives. And as reporters, we don't pay enough attention to people, what they believe. And for instance, in the settlements in the West Bank, in Hebron, there's a settlement called Kiryat Arba, which was a kind of pioneering settlement, one of the very first after the 1967 war. And also a source of, all the settler attacks on the West Bank and so on. Many of them originate there. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Torah, God gives the land to the Jews. And for a lot of these really radical elements, they believe that they own it. I thought I had solved the problem in the Middle East at one point. I read this book, David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister, and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who was the second president. They were expelled from the Ottoman Empire at one point and came to live in Lower Manhattan. And they wrote this book about Israel, the future of Israel. And this is the early turn of the 20th century. And Ben-Zvi especially was kind of an archaeologist. And he used to go into the Arab villages and see menorahs in the windows. He'd see Hebrew in the tombstones. And their theory, and these are the founders of the State of Israel, is that the Palestinians are Jews. And, when the diaspora came, not all the Jews left. Many people just stayed on the land. They converted to Christianity, or they became Muslims, in part to avoid paying taxes. And on top of that, there was the Babylonian exile, which is it's fascinating, but I won't go into it. Sure. But genetic testing has shown that they are the same people, descended from the Canaanites. They're of the same genetic origin, and they have a similar history. So I thought, I'm going to tell everybody in Israel. So when I was doing my one-man show there, I would point out, you guys are the same. Yeah, we know that. Yeah. So it didn't make any difference. So I read another book that was very influential to me called The Need to Have Enemies and Allies by a Cypriot American psychiatrist named Vamik Volkan. And he grew up in Cyprus, and it was populated by the Greeks and Turks, historic enemies. And they're very similar people. They would dress, the men would wear these white robes with different colored sashes, green for the Turks and blue for the Greeks. And they had different cigarettes. So these were markers that's how you knew who they were and why you hated them. And then in Northern Ireland, the Protestants and the Catholics would paint their doors different colors. The Hutus and the Tutsis had to ask which tribe you're in before they kill each other. So this all related from the psychiatrist's point of view to the Freudian notion of the narcissism of minor differences. Okay. And so the smaller the difference, in some ways, the more durable and intense the hatred can be. It's a paradox, right? When you say you're the same people, it doesn't matter at all. We're not enough same that we can't still hate each other.
And I actually think that's when Lucas asked me to come interview you, I think he asked me because, I've covered the Middle East, a novelist and a journalist. I think he doesn't know the real reason I think I'm here to interview you is because I think my mother came tonight. I am a Texan on my mother's side,
yes.
and my father's family are traditionally Jewish.
Yeah.
And so there aren't a lot of, I think, half and halves. And I think you're the perfect person to write about the Middle East, because I think in America, sort of one of our great, insurgent groups has always been the project known as Texas.
Right. That's right. And we continue to fly the flag. Yes.
And the narcissism of small districts. And I feel like you were sort of getting to this in your comments earlier about how America is becoming Middle Eastern. Is how have our differences been accentuated, and how has politics infected every part of our society? And do you see that as someone who's been such a long time watcher of the Middle East? Are there trends that you're seeing in that part of the world that are now manifesting at home?
Well, I've been thinking about this because we tend to say that Israel Palestine is a regional problem, and it's up to them to solve it, and they can't. But it's not a regional problem. The modern terrorism was born in the diaspora of the Palestinians. The conflict has spilled over its boundaries. It's in American streets. It's in the campuses. It's a worldwide problem, and it's deeply embedded now in our politics, and we have no control over it. Mm-hmm. And this is very worrisome, because this conflict. I mean, going back to the genetic similarity, go to Brooklyn. People seem to get along in Brooklyn, and but it's the context of Israel and Palestine where they feel the need to kill each other. Mm-hmm. But those same personalities, if they're placed in some nice neighborhood in Brooklyn, they'll go to the same grocery stores, they go to similar restaurants and stuff like that. They respect each other because of their religiosity in a very secular city. It's a quandary, but they seem unable and I wrote a play about the Camp David Accords, the Carter, Begin, Sadat. Yeah. And then later I wrote the book that I would have based the play on, because it didn't seem to exist. But I marvel at the fact that, when people say how difficult peace is, it's difficult. But Jimmy Carter, a one-term Georgia governor, Menachem Begin, a terrorist, Anwar Sadat, an assassin, get together for 13 days behind the walls of Camp David, and they produce a peace agreement that hasn't been violated a single instance since 1979 when they signed that paper. So it's possible. But Carter lost the election that followed, even lost the Jewish vote. Menachem Begin, he invaded Lebanon. It was supposed to be 2 weeks, and it lasted for 18 years. Yeah. And he became a recluse and had protesters outside his house nearly every day. It was sort of like the hey, LBJ, how many kids do you kill? Yeah. He was humbled and ashamed by this. And then Sadat was assassinated. So they paid a price for making peace. And I think that's, we don't have in that region or in our own country people with the political courage to try to finally bring this conflict to an end. And it's going to take some leaders with that kind of courage to put their own careers and maybe even their lives on the line.
Why fiction? Why did you write a novel?
Well, the interesting thing, as you know, that you can report, but you can't get inside the mind. You can't go through the eyes of the person you're talking to and see the world that way. But you can in a novel. And that's the reason novels will always exist, because no other art form accomplishes that. Yeah. And I intently wanted to not make these characters stereotypes, but to represent their views based on a lot of conversations and experiences that I've had. Much of it poured it into this. I just found that if I could find a way into their minds, then I would, as an author, but also just as a human being, be able to understand this conflict. But I also wanted people to recognize the differences, things that they might not agree with, but understand where those motivations or actions might come from.
And are you, and then we'll open up to questions, are you more optimistic today, less optimistic?
Well, optimism is an endangered species in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, I know.
But I will say.
What do you predict?
Let's get off the prediction.
Okay,
thing.
we'll go to optimism.
It's gotten to be kind of, now if I say something, then people expect it to happen.
Sure, well, are you more or less optimistic?
I've never been
a solution to
optimistic, but when catastrophes happen, events get looser and things can be moved around. And this is certainly one of the biggest catastrophes that's beset the Middle East in a long time. If we miss this opportunity to resolve into a real peace, then it'll just happen again. And it's naive to think that Hamas can be destroyed. It's being created again right now by what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank. It'll continually reproduce itself, and you have to make peace with your enemy. You can't do it through a proxy, and so the refusal to actually try to bring Hamas has talked about, they use different language. They talk about a hudna, a truce of 70 years. Well, that's not nothing.
Yeah.
And, I think that, and Hamas has said that it would withdraw from power and become a political party if we had, that kind of arrangement. Those options ought to be explored. I don't know if they're serious about it, but if it's possible to bring peace, then it's immoral not to go for it.
Well, I will say, when your book landed on my desk, I was, very excited to read it because it was by you. But I also went, wow, this is a gutsy book to write right now. And and after having finished it, I wish more people were writing books like this and telling stories like this, because I think that helps too.
Well, I hope that it helps.
Yeah, I think it does.
It's my goal.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Elliot.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we have some note cards with questions floating around here somewhere.
I have a question. When's your book being published?
Oh, and my next book will come out in August.
All right.
And it does not tackle the Middle East.
Yeah, I've already taken care of that.
Yeah. Okay. So this question, I think we got into this a little bit, but I'll ask again. Were you revising the book when October 7th happened? Sort of where were you at in the process, and how did it? I mean, I imagine this is reading the book. My impression was this is a story you'd been thinking of for a long time.
No, it's been cooking in the kitchen.
And then, but October 7th is very much woven into the structure of the book. So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, when I went in February 2023, it was fact checking.
Right.
I was trying to make sure that I got the names of the trees right and stuff like that. All those little things that you want the readers to not question. And I had pretty much finished a draft of it, and was just going to polish it with these minor changes. And then I had that, my source assaulted and stuff like that, and it was shaking experience. So I went back and I finished the draft and turned it in August, and then 3 months later is October 7th. And the weird thing is that August draft ended with a war, but it wasn't nearly at the same level of intensity and devastation. And so,
I don't think I'm spoiling anything here, but there's a very powerful chunk of the book that really is very visceral about October 7th.
I had a choice to make.
Yeah.
I could either set it back in time, or I could set it forward in time, or I could just go right through it. And I chose that path because I thought, I felt similarly morally challenged when I was writing about 9/11, because in some ways it's sort of a sacred moment in American, and in Israel, October 7th is related to that feeling, and it's a wound, and you don't want to exploit the pain, but I think part of the mission of art is to explain, and that's what I decided I was going to try it anyway.
And again, we probably touched on this a little bit, but do you in your work see a single through line in your, because I think anyone glancing at the books you've written would see just a huge diversity of subjects, but in reflecting on your career, is there sort of one or two golden threads that you're very conscious of?
Well, religion is one.
Yeah.
And I'm not religious. I was a pious teenager, but I always have marveled at the power of religion. And I just finished an article for the New Yorker about the 7 women on death row in Texas and these nuns that go visit them. And I never thought it would happen to me, but I love these nuns. And I've just had the best time with them. And the women on death row are, they're in a kind of profound spot. They're sentenced to die, but it's a limbo because nobody's been executed. Women have been executed for quite a long time. So some of them have been there for almost 3 decades. Wow. And, at least 2 of them are innocent and have been declared innocent. The Fifth Circuit just vacated the sentence and the conviction of one of these ladies that I've been talking to. She's been there for 27 years.
Why can't she get off death row?
I don't know. There's another one that's 2 years ago. She was convicted in Brownsville, murdering her toddler. And what happened is that the toddler had fallen down the stairs, and it had brain damage and then died. And that's what happened. She didn't beat her.
Yeah. But
the prosecutor, the DA, was in the cartel, and he had been selling his office, and she couldn't afford to bribe him, so he needed a victory, and so he suppressed evidence and sentenced her to death. And he went to prison for 7 years and got out on good behavior, and she stayed in prison. Finally, the judge and the new district attorney and the Innocent Project all declared this woman is innocent. Everybody agreed. The courts agreed. Yeah. But she's still on death row. It's like it's really undermined my feeling about justice. Yeah. Not just in Texas, where it's always suspect, but anywhere that when you presume to have the moral authority to kill somebody, you have to be perfect, and we're not perfect.
Yeah. Well, this question, I think, but maybe we just answered, is what is your next book?
I'm going to finish the writing about the nuns because I can't get rid of them. They're still very much a part of my life. Yeah.
I think we kind of went around this question, but I'm wondering if you could just answer it head on. Is why a mystery thriller?
Well,
because it's a very specific genre.
There's a wonderful thing about crime. It bores a hole through society. Yeah. If you're investigating the crime, then you sort of turn the lights on in places that haven't been seen. And I wanted to bore a core into Israeli and Palestinian society and see it as deeply as I could. And nothing better than have 2 detectives, trying to find out who committed this crime and why.
And the last question is a little long. I'll try to. How did you sort of structure the various voices that were going to come in here? A Palestinian American, an Israeli, the handling of perspectives, because it's obviously a very particularly in this subject, a very tricky subject. Did you immediately know that Malik was going to be, was a Palestinian American, Malik? Was there any thought to structuring these perspectives differently, having just a straight, more of a straight Palestinian as the central protagonist, although Malik's family is, I think, pretty well represented in this book and their vantage points. I'm sort of how much of that construction was in your mind from the start?
Well, the two lead characters, were in my mind. But actually, the question gets into imagination.
Right.
And it's really hard to tell you how your imagination works because stuff appears. Ideas float into your brain. And, there's also sort of, when you're creating these characters, you become very close to them. Mm-hmm. And, I have, in previous novels, characters that I still remember. I could write them today because they're still they're still friends in a way. And not every character is a friend, but I think I want to have every character have a complexity about them so that they don't fit into a stereotype. They surprise you. Not everybody. There was a distinction E.M. Forrester made in one of his essays about flat and round characters.
Right.
And flat characters are really stereotypes. They're defined by one thing. Mm-hmm. They are coarse. They're hysterical.
Right.
They're in mourning. But whenever you come on that character, that is a flat character because they're not going to change. Mm-hmm. And a round character is, in my lingo, I call them donkeys. Yeah. I know it sounds bad, but donkeys are beasts of burden, right. And they can carry a lot of information on their back, and they can take the reader into a world he's never been in. So when I'm writing nonfiction or a novel, I am looking for these donkeys that can, like in the Looming Tower.
Right.
After the towers fell, I knew I had to write about it, but how? Mm-hmm. And so I started going through obituaries, and on the Washington Post site, there was an obituary for John O'Neill, who was the chief of counterterrorism at the NY FBI. And he had been kicked out of the FBI for taking information out of the office, and then took a job at the World Trade Center. So instead of getting bin Laden got him. And I thought, well, I don't know if he's a hero or a goat, but he's a hell of a donkey.
Yeah.
He can take us into the FBI and show us why we failed. Mm-hmm. And it turned out he was a heroic figure in many respects, and he died on 9/11. Yeah. But I try to do the same thing with my fictional characters. I can see a place for a character, but like Yossi's daughter, mm-hmm. she appeared. A door opened in my imagination.
Was she the first character to appear in this book?
She was...
In your mind?
Oh, in my mind?
Yeah,
I suppose, yeah.
She was the germ?
I needed somebody who... Usually with a flat character, their duty is in service of the round one.
Right.
But she got rounder and rounder, and I began to really feel...
The book kind of becomes about her.
Yeah.
In many ways.
Yes. And it offered the opportunity for Malik to show another side of his life. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, the characters just grow in the environment. If you have the right soil to plant them in, they can mature and become more interesting. And then the more interesting they become, the more you want to entertain them.
Yeah. Well, these are great characters, and this is a great book, and thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you, Elliot. Thanks so much. It was great.
Pleasure.
Thank you.